The HR director called me at 4:45 in the afternoon on a Friday. Nothing good ever starts with, "Do you have a minute?" I have always believed Seattle has its own way of warning you about trouble. It does not use thunder or violent storms. All it needs is a drizzle, a window fogged with breath, a soft gray sky stretched thin like a veil, and you know something is about to crash down with no warning at all. I stood in my office on the 19th floor of Northbridge Freight Systems, looking down at the Seattle port. The cranes moved slowly, lifting each container as if they were a giant toy blocks. A ship was preparing to leave. Its horn released a long, low sound that rolled across the water. Everything looked normal, normal enough to make me wary. I am Rachel Monroe, 46 years old, Senior Infrastructure Contract Specialist. In simple terms, I read what no one else has the patience to read, and I write the things the entire company depends on so we do not get sued or shut down. ClearRoute, Northbridge's safety and routing system, falls under my responsibility. Leadership likes to display safety slogans everywhere, but somehow they never quite remember who created the legal framework that keeps those promises intact. The desk phone blinked. Linda Pierce from Human Resources. I checked the clock. 4:45. A call from Human Resources at that hour is like someone knocking right as you sink into the couch. It never brings good news, I answered. Linda started with that familiar tone. Rachel, ClearRoute has been a tremendous success. Last quarter was fantastic. Your contribution has been vital to the company. The truth is, when human resources begins with praise, it means they are about to take something away from you. I listened without interrupting. Experience told me the unpleasant part would arrive in a few more sentences. And then it did. About your raise for this quarter, Linda said, her voice dropping. We have to delay it. This is a sensitive period with the Harborline federal contract and the upcoming audit. We do not want your name appearing too prominently in front of the auditors. I sat down. So my raise is being postponed because of a federal contract. I asked each word clearly, not irritated, just precise. Linda circled it. Not exactly. It is more about timing. The initial public offering is approaching, investor image matters, and risk must be managed carefully. I let a moment of silence settle. Silence always makes vague explanations reveal their true shape. All right, I said quietly. Send me an email summarizing the reason. I want it documented. She agreed very quickly. People who rely on vague excuses always rush to comply when you ask for proof. I hung up, opened my notebook, and wrote one line. Friday, 4:45 in the afternoon. Raise is delayed due to contract risk. I looked at the sentence. Short, sharp, and enough to remind me that stability rarely comes from the company. My personal phone buzzed. Emily, my daughter, is 24, a new nurse. Mom, they denied my overtime again. Budget constraints. Corporate logic is wild. I exhaled and texted back. Welcome to the club. Call me tonight. There is a special kind of exhaustion that only people who have heard the phrase budget constraints understand. The irony was not lost on me. My daughter and I lived in two entirely different workplaces, yet somehow we were hearing the same song. I turned back to the window. The ship below had pulled away from the dock, gliding through the rain, leaving ripples that the wind kept breaking apart. The sight made me think of myself, not loud, not dramatic, but still moving, still pushing forward, even when others wanted me to stay still. I walked to the personal filing cabinet beside my desk. While the company loved bragging about digitizing everything, I kept hard copies of the contracts that mattered, the ones large enough to save or destroy a company. Harborline was one of them. I opened the second drawer. A dark blue folder appeared. The label read, Harborline Green Corridor Agreement, 80 million, executed, in force. I placed the folder on my desk. I did not open it. Some documents you know instinctively that once you open them, you will never return to where you were before. I sat down and looked at it for a few seconds, as if it had appeared on its own to remind me of something. I thought about Linda's words. Audit, initial public offering, risk, investor image. All polished words are used to cover a simple truth. They did not want to pay. 3 years in a row, there was always a new excuse. First year, the market. Second year, the initial public offering. This year, the audit. None of them had anything to do with my actual value. I turned off the desk lamp and was about to leave when I glanced at the folder again. One thought rose, steady and calm. If they think my salary can shake a contract, then it is time to see what the contract actually says. Before stepping out, I turned toward the audience listening to this story. Whether you are in Los Angeles, Boston, or some small town somewhere in Europe, and I ask you, have you ever been told this is not the right time for your raise? If you have, tell me where you are listening from. I want to see how wide the map of delayed promises can stretch. I closed the office door behind me, the lock clicking softly. Outside, Seattle's light rain was trying to become something heavier. But tonight, that did not matter. This weekend, I will open the Harbor Line file. I will read every line. I will find out what in that agreement is strong enough to make Northbridge fear adjusting the salary of one employee. If they claim my salary as a contract risk, then it is time to ask the contract what it thinks about that. Northbridge liked to say that safety was in their DNA. The line always made me let out a quiet laugh, because if that were true, they must have forgotten who wrote the first strands of that code. On Friday night, I drove out of the downtown district as the rain faded to only a few scattered drops. The road sloped gently toward the suburbs, flanked by rows of trees that no longer carried the noise of the city. After a long day, silence was the only thing that felt comforting. I turned off the engine, stepped inside the house, and called Emily on video. My daughter was sitting on a folding chair in her hospital dorm. Her hair was tied back, her face still marked by the outline of a mask. "Mom, they denied my overtime again," she said. "The reason is the budget. Their budget seems to run out only when it is my turn." I studied her tired expression. "Do not agree to anything until you understand it fully," I told her. "In any organization, people hope you stay busy enough not to read the details." Emily laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that comes from understanding, not amusement. The call ended, the screen went dark, and the house returned to its familiar quiet. I leaned against the kitchen counter and let the early years at Northbridge come back to me. Back then, Northbridge was an old logistics giant struggling to keep pace with a new era. They ran freight trains, trucks, warehouses, and interstate corridors. They loved slogans like safety first and green corridors. Those words hung from boardrooms to storage yards. But anyone who had worked long enough in the industry knew a slogan could not save anyone without a system behind it. When I joined, Clearroute was just an idea on a draft. I came in at the very beginning, defining safety standards, building the legal framework, and translating algorithms into contractual terms that could actually hold up. When Clearroute reduced accidents and fuel waste, I felt satisfied, not because of recognition, but because I knew it was right. During that time, Northbridge secured the Harbor Line Green Corridor contract with the Port of San Francisco and the Federal Green Infrastructure Program. $80 million, a figure that the entire company repeated as proof that we were back in the race. I remember the day we finalized that agreement. Most of the office lights were off, leaving only the glow from my desk and the former chief executive officer's lamp. He stood at the doorway holding a cup of cold coffee and said something that made me think differently about my role. "You should protect yourself. One day they will forget who built the foundation of this whole system." I listened. In the appendix, I wrote a small clause for the name system architect. The text was so small that if you did not know to look for it, your eyes would slide right past. The clause stated that if Clearroute met safety and environmental benchmarks for 3 consecutive quarters, the named system architect would receive an innovation participation bonus, retain a seat on the Safety and Compliance Committee, and be protected under whistleblower and non-retaliation provisions. All legal, all transparent, all reasonable. And most importantly, my name was there in the appendix, printed in black ink. No one objected. At the time, everyone just wanted the contract signed so the federal and port agreements could close. I treated it as a safety harness. I never imagined that one day the clause would become the one anchor the company could not quietly push aside. A few years later, the former chief executive officer left. The new leadership arrived with a different posture, fast, transactional, and sometimes blind to detail. They read revenue reports faster than they read contract appendices. When Clearroot succeeded, they talked about algorithms and data structures, rarely about the people who built its legal backbone. Looking back at the 3 years of denied raises, I can see it clearly. Each year came with a new excuse: market instability, pre IPO tightening, federal contract risk. The words changed, but the nature remained the same. They expected me never to ask why. I poured more tea and sat at the kitchen table. The warm light reflected off the planner I had left open earlier. The words Harborline Contract sat in the middle of the page like a reminder that some things must be revisited, not out of curiosity, but out of fairness. I leaned back and remembered the former chief executive officer's warning: protect yourself. I had not understood it then, but 3 years of delays, 3 cycles of excuses, and repeated evasions made me realize the appendix I wrote was not just preparation. It existed to ensure that the person who built the framework could not be erased when the company decided the wind was finally blowing in their favor. Outside, the rain began to fall more steadily. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the soft rhythm of water on the roof, like someone knocking gently to remind me there was work to do. I opened my eyes again and looked at the planner. The Harborline file was not only $80 million, it was the culmination of a safety system I had built piece by piece. And if there was anything in that contract that answered why they truly wanted to postpone my raise, I would find it, not for the money, but because I refused to be labeled a risk, simply because others were too lazy to read what they had signed. I closed the planner. There was no anger left, no disappointment, only clarity. Northbridge forgets details, but the details do not forget Northbridge. I always keep paper copies of the contracts that can change the direction of my life. And the Harbor Line Agreement, if read in the right order, has the potential to force a company the size of Northbridge to change direction as well. On that Saturday morning, when Seattle was still wet from the night rain and the neighbors had not yet opened their car doors for the market run, I walked into my home office. The room was not large, but it was quiet enough for important things to be spoken. I opened the cabinet and pulled out the Harbor Line contract. Its cover was slightly worn at the corner where I used to hold it back when the company was desperate to win this deal at any cost. The stack was thick, marked with colored tabs, each one representing a story Northbridge had long been too busy to remember. I set it on the desk and opened it to the appendix bearing my name. The small line of text was still there, unfaded and beyond anyone's ability to erase. As I opened the contract, I powered on my laptop. The internal data system prompted a 2-step verification, a procedure people usually complained about for wasting time, but one that allowed me to see the things others tried to hide. I began downloading the safety and environmental reports from the past 2 to 3 years on the routes where Clearroute had been deployed. The numbers stretched across the screen: fewer accidents, fewer regulatory violations, emissions levels below federal targets. Not marginal improvements, but steady, consistent, undeniable progress. Looking at the charts, I realized the milestone in the clause had not only been met, but exceeded for more than a year and a half. The clause I once inserted to ensure innovation would be protected now sat before me, clear as a late knock from the past. A memory returned suddenly. It was a winter night 3 years earlier. A young driver had pushed his speed entering a slick curve, and Clearroute had issued a warning as the automatic braking system intervened. The next day, I received a thank you email from a supervisor. The message had only one sentence, but I kept it for years. Your system probably saved his life. I never printed emails like that for praise. I kept them to remind myself that Glassdoor reviews or performance reports never tell the full story of why a job matters. I returned to the appendix with my name on it. The line was simple: if Clearroute meets safety and environmental benchmarks for 3 consecutive quarters, Northbridge must activate the Innovation Participation Bonus and grant the named system architect an official seat on the Safety and Compliance Committee, along with whistleblower and non-retaliation protections. I had written that clause with the backing of the former chief executive officer, who once told me safety could not be just a slogan printed on posters. But he was gone now, and with him went the memory of what leadership had once promised: The milestone had been reached. The obligation had not. I opened my old email folder. The company's search system was slow, but patience is a required skill in this line of work. After a few minutes, I found the exchange between human resources and finance from the exact period when Clearroot hit its milestone. Human resources wrote, "Maybe we should wait until after the initial public offering before addressing this safety clause. Avoid creating more stories if auditors ask." Finance replied, "If we pay out all the innovation bonuses we signed for, this quarter's margin will not look good. Push it to later." After that, no email ever mentioned the obligation again. The clause lay there like a doorstop that everyone assumed could be kicked aside forever. But clauses do not die. They simply wait for someone patient enough to look. I read Linda's email from the previous afternoon again. My raise was being delayed because my name appeared too prominently in a federal contract. A soft, thoughtful reason, if one ignored the fact that the company had used ClearRoute's results to strengthen their federal reporting for 2 full years, while the obligations tied to the person who built that system had quietly evaporated from the budget. I began printing every related email, human resources suggesting delays, finance admitting they were avoiding costs, and the reports proving ClearRoute had exceeded the required benchmarks. The printed pages carried a faint warmth, a scent anyone who has worked with legal files would recognize. I never liked that smell, but today it felt like a signal that the truth was finally being brought into the light. I placed everything into a folder and labeled it Harborline Incentive Compliance. It sounded like the name of a new project, but in reality, it was proof that the company had failed to honor what it had signed. When I set the folder on the desk, I knew exactly what I was holding. Not a stack of documents, but a piece of the promise Northbridge had chosen to forget. And that was when I realized this was no longer about a raise, not about base pay adjustments, or the soft excuses delivered over a Friday afternoon call. This was about safety and responsibility, about how they used the data I built to promote achievements while denying the protections meant for the person who created those achievements. I left the folder on the desk and sat down. The room was quiet, not the comforting kind, but the kind that arrives before a strong wind. A boundary had been crossed, and when Northbridge chose to cross it, they forgot something simple. A small line of text is never decoration. I closed the contract. Part of the story was now clear, and the rest was waiting for me to knock on its door. What lay before me was not a stack of paper, it was a question. How long would it take before they finally understood that what they tried to hide from auditors was sitting in the one place they never bothered to read? People like to say numbers never lie. I disagree. Numbers are very good at keeping silent when someone hides them in the right place at the right time. And in a company preparing for an initial public offering, the silence of numbers is the most expensive silence of all. On Saturday afternoon, after gathering enough documents about the clause in the Harborline contract, I returned to my laptop and opened the internal finance system. If the contract had been asleep in a drawer for years, the financial software was the place where the truth kept running every minute, whether people wanted to see it or not. The screen loaded more slowly than usual. Northbridge's system was always sluggish on weekends, and perhaps I was the only person who thought that was reasonable. Slow or not, it still allowed me to look into the things others hoped I would forget. I opened every report tied to Harborline for the past 3 years. Revenue was steady, even slightly rising, each time Clearroute reached a new safety milestone. Costs were tucked into harmless-sounding categories like operations, technical adjustments, and compliance fees. I scrolled deeper into the section most people never notice: innovation costs and performance incentives. There, I found a placeholder entry labeled Innovation Bonus. Not explicit, not detailed, but present from the moment the contract was signed. I opened each quarter one by one, many empty rows, a few tiny reserved budgets, but absolutely no actual payout to any individual. Not a single transfer, not a single annotation, not a single name. Clearroute had been used as proof of achievement for 2 straight years, but the reward for the person who created the system looked like a punctuation mark erased from a draft. I opened the reports submitted to the Port of San Francisco and the Federal Green Infrastructure Program side by side. Attached were bright blue and green charts. Clearroute had reduced a large percentage of accidents, lowered emissions by significant percentages, and optimized fuel consumption. 3 full pages of achievements, accompanied by a photograph of a freight train running against a sunset and smiling employees in reflective vests. A picture painted with pride. I stared at that image and thought of the call from Human Resources the day before, telling me that my raise was too sensitive to process, that my name should not appear in any report. Interesting how the company believed the results I created could appear everywhere, while the person behind them had to step back like an unnecessary detail. That evening, I drove to my brother Mark's house. He had been a long-haul driver for 20 years before a skid on icy pavement injured his back and forced him into early retirement. We had a simple dinner, grilled salmon and salad, exactly what his doctor wanted him to eat more of. When I mentioned that I was reviewing a contract because something felt off, Mark was quiet for a moment before he spoke, his voice low and slow, like someone who had spent years on the road. If I had clear back then, my back might not be like this. I looked at him, at the part of his back that always ached when the weather changed. My work had never been just words on paper, but his sentence made it clearer than ever. Clearroute was never a clever idea in a conference room. It was the space between a crash and a life saved. The very thing the company used to decorate reports, but refused to pay for properly. When I got home, I opened my laptop again. I wanted to check whether there were any more traces of the intent to delay the bonus. I searched under the chief financial officer's name, and as expected, one email stood out. His line was shorter and colder than any financial chart. If we start paying out every innovation clause we have ever signed, those margins you love so much are going to get very small, very fast. A calm sentence, almost sounding like investment advice. But its nature was not a warning. It was a deliberate choice, trading legal obligations for a prettier narrative, trading real work for artificial numbers. I printed the email and placed it with the rest of the documents. The paper felt colder this time. Or perhaps my hands were colder. I could not tell. The only clarity was this. If these documents reached the right federal hands, the issue would no longer be creative accounting during an initial public offering season. It would strike directly at the spirit of the contract. And that spirit was written in federal money, not internal preference. Night had fully fallen. I turned off the television, leaving only the sound of rain tapping lightly against the window. The room was so quiet I could hear the paper rustle as I flipped to the clause protecting those who speak up. I read each line slowly, carefully, as if listening to an old promise echoing back to me. They had signed a commitment to protect the one who spoke up. They simply never imagined that person would be me. I closed the folder. They could dodge the numbers for a while, but not forever. Numbers do not lie. They only wait for the right moment to speak. And tonight, they had started speaking already. I did not call an attorney first, not because I lacked options or evidence. I had enough documents to turn an ordinary workday at Northbridge into an emergency meeting for the entire leadership team. But attorneys are scalpels for the final stage. What I needed now was a light touch, just enough to make the system tremble. And the best way was to tap the one party Northbridge would never risk offending: the customer who bought an $80 million solution. On Sunday morning, Seattle was gray, and a thin layer of fog pressed against the window as if reminding me that everything has a place to hide. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and reopened the Harbor Line Incentive Compliance folder. If I kept the story contained inside the company, they would twist my intent into a personal complaint, the same way they always did when an employee asked a question that made management uncomfortable. I had no patience to let them rewrite the narrative in their favor. I needed a different kind of gravity, a pull strong enough that refusal would no longer be a decision in the hands of those avoiding their obligations. I opened my laptop and wrote an email to Dean Alvarez, General Counsel for the Port of San Francisco. He was the one who signed the Harbor Line contract with me and the former Chief Executive Officer years ago. Someone who understood that a clause is not decoration. The message was short and neutral. Dean, I have some questions regarding the safety incentive clause in the Harbor Line appendix. Let me know when you are available to discuss. I sent it, not expecting a quick reply. But only a few minutes later, a notification appeared. Video call at noon on Monday. At the scheduled time, I turned on my camera. Dean's office appeared on screen. Clean, orderly. Behind him, a wide window overlooks the port of San Francisco. Cranes are moving containers, a vessel releasing a plume of smoke as it left the dock. The distant announcements echoed through the terminal, a reminder that in this industry, every minute costs real money, not adjustable numbers, in an initial public offering report. Dean leaned toward the screen. Rachel, what is happening with that clause? I explained. No embellishment, no detours, only data. Clearwrote had met the safety and environmental benchmarks for more than a year and a half. The named system architect clause was mandatory. Northbridge had fulfilled none of its obligations. No bonus, no oversight seat, no formal acknowledgement. Yet they continued using Clearwrote's achievements to report to the port and the federal program. Dean said nothing for several seconds. I saw the subtle change in his expression, the shift that experienced contract readers recognize instantly. He was assembling the pieces into a larger structure. He asked a single question. You are certain the milestones were met exactly as required. I shared my screen. Safety reports, emissions data, internal emails showing the dates they knew and chose not to act. Dean leaned back, tapping his pen lightly against the desk. The port is already unhappy about Northbridge increasing environmental fees without a clear explanation. And now you are telling me they ignored a clause protecting the person who built the system. This goes against the intent of the Green Infrastructure Program. He did not raise his voice, but the slow emphasis on each word told me I was not the only one sensing the contract had been misused. I stated it plainly. I am not looking for a fight. But if the safety incentive mechanism is not carried out, the federal oversight system will be misled, and that is something I will not stay silent about. Dean inhaled, then opened a document on his screen. Here is what I propose. We will send a compliance audit request. No accusations, no adversarial language. But we will ask Northbridge to confirm whether they have fulfilled their obligations to the named system architect. We will request supporting documentation. And we will set a specific deadline. If they fail to respond, the port will have to reevaluate the reliability of this partnership. I listened to each word and understood that I had just placed a serious spark under the rug the company had used to hide what it wanted forgotten. Dean looked directly at me. Are you concerned this will trigger a strong reaction inside your company? I answered, calmer than I expected. If they react strongly, it means they know the clause matters. And if it matters, they should not have ignored it in the first place. Dean nodded. I will send the letter before the end of the day. If needed, I will contact you again. The call ended. I turned off the screen, stood up, and walked a slow circle around the kitchen like someone who had just stepped out of a boardroom, knowing the entire company's atmosphere was about to shift in ways no one could predict. I placed my hand on the counter and looked out the window. Seattle was still raining. A thin, persistent rain, as if the weather itself understood that things had entered a stage that could not be undone. They wanted to hide the problem under the audit rug. I only lifted one corner, and whatever lies under that rug was placed there by their own hands. On Monday morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, looking for one familiar thing: silence. But silence did not last long. Because when human resources smells smoke, they do not need to know where the fire is. They only need someone standing closest to the match. And that morning, they remembered my name very quickly. By Tuesday, the compliance audit request from the dean had been officially sent to the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, the legal department, and human resources. I was not copied, but I did not need to be. The shockwaves in the Seattle hallway were loud enough. People who usually walked casually were now moving faster. Those who normally smiled looked tense, as if pulled a wire, and high-priority emails kept landing in the shared inbox, as if the office had caught a fever. Around mid-morning, I heard the chief financial officer had called an internal meeting, a small one, without inviting me. That did not surprise me. When people need a clean story, they gather in closed rooms before stepping out with a narrative already shaped. Years in this field had taught me that rule. A colleague sitting near the meeting room whispered that the chief financial officer was genuinely worried. If they admitted they had not activated the bonus clause despite the safety milestones being met, federal auditors would ask directly, and the initial public offering, the obsession of the season, would be stopped at the gate. So the chief financial officer had suggested that legal reinterpret the name system architect clause, turning it into something discretionary, effective only when leadership decided. Of course, that went against what was written in the contract, but no one seemed to care about the written word anymore. By noon, I received an email from Linda Pierce, the Human Resources Director. Linda usually wrote with a softness that made her sound like she was calming a nervous child, but today her words were as rigid as stone. Rachel, we received an audit request from the port. Please explain why you did not previously submit documentation to activate the bonus and committee role as outlined in the appendix. That question was not meant to be asked. It was meant to push. I saw it immediately. Their plan was simple: shift the responsibility onto me. Turn me into the person who forgot, the person who failed to act, the one who created the issue. In any internal investigation, the first suspect is always the one who was not invited into the leadership room. That afternoon, I received an invitation to a quick discussion from legal. I stepped into a small meeting room where the white lighting made everyone's face look paler than usual. On the table was a printed internal memo, which they slid toward me. It stated that the bonus and the named system architect role were optional items, requiring a separate leadership decision before taking effect. They wanted me to sign to keep the audit file consistent. I read it fully, saying nothing for several seconds. Then I closed the packet and slid it back. I will not sign an internal document that contradicts the contract submitted to the federal government, I said, and the contract does not read the way this memo does. No one spoke, but the tension compressed the room like air before a storm. I did not need to mention whistleblower and non-retaliation protections, but I did, with an even tone. I will also note that the Harbor Line contract includes protections for the individual who speaks up. I trust all of you remember that. That sentence landed like a pin dropping. Every exchange glance carried enough concern that I did not need to explain further. They knew that if they pressured me to sign, the story would move somewhere far beyond their control. The door opened, and the chief financial officer entered. He did not sit. He stood at the head of the table as if presiding over a quiet trial. His voice was higher than usual, not loud, but sharp like a glass edge. Do you know what you have just done? Do you understand how much this contract is worth? And what its impact is on the initial public offering? Hundreds of jobs could feel the consequences of your actions. I looked at him with a calmness that surprised even me. I am protecting the livelihood of the person the contract promised to protect. And if you can ignore a signature with me today, there is no guarantee you will not ignore someone else's signature tomorrow. The chief financial officer went silent. I was not the loudest voice in the room, but sometimes volume has nothing to do with weight. The meeting ended with no one getting what they wanted. They wanted my signature. I wanted them to remember why contracts are written. Both sides left dissatisfied, but only one side understood the matter was far from over. That evening, I stayed home and called Emily. I did not share details, only that the company had asked me to sign a memo contradicting the contract. Mom, are they allowed to do that? She asked, her voice tighter than usual. Allowed? No. Likely to try. Absolutely, I said. Do not worry. I know what I am doing. The answer was partly for her and partly for me, a reminder that I was still standing exactly where I needed to stand. After the call, I sat in the living room for a long time. The light cast a long gold strip across the floor, like a strange dividing line between two worlds. The world where contracts were written to protect people, and the world where contracts were bent to protect corporate image. I understood one thing clearly. They would not fix the issue themselves. They were only looking for a scapegoat, and I had been placed at the center. They thought I would stay silent to keep my job. They forgot one thing. I am the person who built the system that keeps everyone else alive. I walked into Wednesday morning with the sense that time had compressed. From the moment the audit request left Dean's office and landed in the leadership inbox, every movement inside Northbridge carried a shade of caution. People say no one wants to meet with human resources in the middle of the week. It is even truer when human resources invites you to a discussion and adds that a legal representative will attend. Linda's meeting request arrived exactly 8 minutes earlier, not enough time to prepare, or at least that is what they believed. They forgot I had been preparing for years, back when I wrote every line of the Harbor Line contract. The Human Resources conference room sat at the end of the hallway, where pastel posters lined the walls, declaring slogans like, "We value our people and transparency matters." I had never seen them do anything except remind me that sometimes irony does not need to be spoken aloud. I entered the room with a thick canvas bag at my side. Linda was already seated, trying to maintain a friendly expression. Beside her was a younger in house attorney, hands clasped together as if silently praying for a peaceful conversation. They both looked at me with the hope that I had arrived with a cooperative spirit. Then they noticed the bag. I pulled out a chair, sat down, and did not speak first. Instead, I placed the bag on the table, unzipped it slowly, and brought out the hard copy of the Harbor Line contract. The thick stack landed on the table with weight and intention. I heard Linda inhale, not loudly, but enough to know she understood this would not be a light discussion. I flipped to the page containing the named system architect clause and the whistleblower protections. Then I placed the compliance audit request from Dean on top, angled so both of them could read every line. Everything was deliberate, measured, like laying on the table the exact thing they had been avoiding for years. Linda broke the silence first. Her voice was soft, the kind of softness trained to sound caring while stepping around the truth. "Rachel, we want to make sure you are not placed at the center of the audit. This is a sensitive time. We are only trying to protect you." I looked directly at her. "I have been at the center since the day my name was written in this appendix. I did not put myself there. The company did when it signed the contract." Linda pressed her lips together. The in-house attorney opened his mouth, ready to talk about interpreting the contract, but I pointed at the small line where my name sat. My tone did not change. "This clause is not decoration. It carries obligations. Not fulfilling it is not protection. It is a breach of a federal commitment." The conference room door opened suddenly. The chief financial officer entered without warning, without apology for being late. He did not sit but stood at the end of the table, leaning lightly on a chair, his expression both tense and accusatory. "Rachel, I have one simple question. What did you tell the port? And do you understand the financial consequences of this?" I did not blink. The tension in the room did not tighten my breath the way they likely expected. I told them the safety incentive clause had not been fulfilled. The rest is their responsibility, just as signing the contract was the responsibility of leadership here. My answer hit the room like a weighted drop. The attorney looked away. Linda clasped her hands tighter under the table. The chief financial officer tilted his head slightly, as if assessing the danger of my words. A long silence followed. The hum of the air system sounded louder than usual. Outside, the rhythm of typing echoed like a clock ticking down. They did not speak, but their eyes stayed fixed on the documents as if the papers might detonate. I picked up a pen, not to sign, but to mark a boundary clearly. From this point on, all communication related to this clause will go through my attorney and the port's attorney. I will not sign any internal document that weakens the company's obligations to the federal government. It was not a threat, it was a fact, and they knew it. The attorney swallowed. Linda looked down at her hands. The chief financial officer stared at the contract as if it were an unfamiliar object that had fallen from the sky. No one asked another question. I stood, placed everything back into my canvas bag, and headed toward the door. Before leaving, I noticed Linda's eyes flick toward the poster behind her. "We value our people." The poster had not changed, but suddenly it looked like it was hiding something behind it. I did not look back at them, but I knew the final image left in that room would be the Harbor Line contract spread open on the table, the audit letter lying on top, and the heavy realization that for the first time, they had been forced to face the small line of text they had ignored. Crossing the doorway, I thought to myself. For the first time, I saw them look at the fine print as if the words had teeth. The board of directors sent a closed meeting invitation on Thursday morning. No explanation, no detailed agenda, just one line confirming I was required to attend. In a company like Northbridge, fewer words always meant more trouble. The conference room on the 14th floor was in a part of the building most employees had only heard about but never entered. A long wooden table, dark leather chairs, and cold lighting that sharpened every face in the room. 3 board members were already seated. When I walked in, all 3 avoided my eyes. I was not surprised. People do not look directly at what they know they must confront. The chief executive officer and the chief financial officer sat side by side. The human resources director had folded herself into her chair as if trying to disappear into the padding. The general counsel stared at a thick binder, though I doubted he absorbed a single word. My attorney sat beside me, notebook open, saying nothing. On the screen at the head of the table, Dean Alvarez appeared. Behind him, a wide window looked out over the port of San Francisco, sunlight catching the water like a reminder that other stakeholders were watching this closely. The meeting began with the low, steady voice of the board chair. He asked Dean to speak first. Dean was concise. Every word is clear, leaving no room for reinterpretation. The safety incentive mechanism was not optional. It existed to ensure transparency and accountability in green infrastructure projects. And if Northbridge failed to carry it out, the port would have to reconsider the company's standing as a partner. He added nothing and removed nothing. He simply stated a fact. The chief financial officer immediately leaned forward, gripping the table edge as if it might anchor him. He explained that everything was just an internal misunderstanding, that prior leadership had left unclear processes, and that my department had not submitted activation paperwork. It sounded like a story assembled hastily overnight, with several corners still rough. I opened my bag and placed the Harborline Incentive Compliance folder in the center of the table. Every pair of eyes shifted toward it. I laid out each document so they could see the dates, the subject lines, the senders, and the recipients. Here is the email from Human Resources proposing to delay activation of the bonus. Here is the email from the Chief Financial Officer stating that paying innovation bonuses would damage quarterly margins. Here is the timeline showing that Clearwrote met all requirements more than a year and a half ago. I spoke softly, but without gentleness. There was no delay on my part, only a decision to postpone from leadership. My attorney slid forward copies of the whistleblower and non-retaliation clauses. Her voice was calm, but cold enough to lower the temperature in the room. These clauses protect the individual who speaks up. If internal pressure continues, the legal risk increases significantly, both horizontally and vertically. The Human Resources Director lowered her head further. The General Counsel leaned toward the Chief Financial Officer, but said nothing. Even he seemed unable to find a reasonable cover story. The board chair folded his hands and looked directly at me. What options do you believe the company is facing? I answered plainly. 2 options. 1. Acknowledge the failure and correct it. That means paying the full innovation participation bonus plus interest, adjusting my base salary to match the role in market, granting the governance position exactly as the appendix outlines, and restructuring the internal process to ensure safety and environmental clauses are honored going forward. I paused. 2. Continue to deny and face a federal audit. In that case, the company risks losing the Harborline contract, jeopardizing the initial public offering, and triggering a review of every financial footprint in similar agreements. Dean spoke from the screen. If the board chose the first path, the port would record that Northbridge had resolved the issue. If it chose the second, he would have to escalate the matter into formal audit procedures. His tone was that of a man who did not want escalation but would not hesitate. The chief financial officer clung to one last argument. This will set a bad precedent. We cannot allow a small clause to dictate how we operate. I looked at him steadily. If it is small, why did you hide it? The question fell into the room and left behind a silence with no space for rebuttal. I placed my formal proposal on the table. Everything was contained in a single sheet of paper, though its weight was anything but small. Full payment of bonus and interest, salary adjustment, appointment as Director of Safety and Contract Governance, reporting directly to the board, separation from human resources and the Chief Financial Officer's oversight to prevent conflicts of interest, a new internal policy on whistleblower and non-retaliation across all safety and environmental projects. The board chair looked at each member, then said, "We accept the agreement." There were no congratulations, no visible relief, only the acknowledgement that a system had been forced to remember what it had once signed. The chief financial officer was encouraged to pursue new opportunities. So was the human resources director. No one used the word termination. But when a board speaks of new opportunities, it means the old one no longer exists. I left the room while Dean was still on the screen. He gave me a small nod. Not a celebration, just recognition that this had finally been handled the way it should have been from the beginning. As the conference room door closed behind me, I thought, it was never me winning. It was the contract remembering what it had promised. 6 months later, the thing that surprised me most was not that Northbridge passed the audit cleanly, but a far simpler truth. No one talked about it anymore. Yet everyone, from new hires to longtime managers, reads their contracts more carefully. A quiet shift, like someone deciding to buckle their seatbelt without needing to be reminded. Harbor Line kept running smoothly. The reports sent to the Port of San Francisco were clearer than in any previous year. No more unexplained environmental fee increases. When Dean called for a quick check-in, he simply said everything looked healthier. I understood what he meant. Transparency does not generate immediate profit, but it does generate trust. And in a federal project, trust is gold. Inside Northbridge, a few chairs were changed. The chief financial officer pursued new opportunities, according to his farewell email. People wished him luck, though everyone knew a few federal questions would follow him for a while. The human resources director announced an early retirement. She said she wanted more time with her grandchildren. I thought it was a wise choice. Some battles are better left before the ending arrives. The legal department changed the fastest. They no longer forwarded documents without reading. Compliance meetings ran longer, but for the first time in years, they were asking the right questions. Every time the general counsel walked past my office, he gave a small nod. Not polite, more like acknowledgement from someone who had once stared into an abyss and chosen to step back. My new office was much smaller than the boardroom, but it had a window overlooking the port. I often watched the cranes lifting containers, thinking about the precision required for every movement. Contract language worked the same way. Half a line out of place could throw an entire system off balance. With my new title, Director of Safety and Contract Governance, I led a small but sharp team. We reviewed every contract containing safety, environmental, or whistleblower clauses to see how they were truly being carried out. Not to hunt mistakes, but to make sure no one's protections were buried under footnotes someone hoped would go unread. One weekend evening, I met Emily and Mark at a restaurant near the waterfront. Emily shared that her hospital had revised its overtime policy after staff spoke up. She said it with a tone bordering on disbelief, as if she still could not believe something that small could turn the gears of a system. Mark lifted his glass, his eyes bright under the warm lights. To the people who read the fine print so the rest of us do not get crushed. I laughed, then felt my throat tighten. Not because of the words, but because I could see what lived behind them. A lifetime of long-haul driving, accidents avoided and not avoided, and systems built to protect people that companies sometimes forgot to protect their creators. When I returned home, I opened my email. A message from the new human resources team appeared, short and direct. My compensation package had been approved without issue. I replied with thanks and added one sentence. Make sure it does not get lost in contract risk again. The reply came faster than expected. Noted. It will not be lost. The next morning, I was invited to speak at an internal session on safety and compliance. I did not prepare slides. I just stood in the room and shared three things. A contract is not a jacket for displaying slogans. The fine print determines how people live, work, and are treated. And that is when a company signs something. The words belong to the people affected by them, not just the ones who sign. When I finished, I realized many faces in the room no longer looked afraid of the fine print. They looked like they understood it, a kind of maturity unique to American workplaces. Quiet, not dramatic, just the courage to read what others ignore. And now, the storyteller in me wants to turn to you, wherever you are listening from. Maybe your raise once got lost between human resources and policy. Maybe someone told you it was not the right time. Or maybe you simply want to know what happens when an ordinary person decides to read the words an entire system hoped they would skip. If you want more stories about the quiet people who keep systems from running over their lives, subscribe to the channel. And if you are listening from a small town, a seaside retirement home, or the center of a big city, leave a comment. I want to know where you are listening from and what you have lived through. Before ending the day, I returned to my office, opened the file cabinet, and looked at the Harbor Line contract resting neatly in the third drawer. 6 months earlier, it had felt like a ticking bomb. Now, it was simply a quiet but powerful reminder of one truth. When they sign it, the words do not belong only to them. They also belong to the ones patient enough, steady enough, to read all the way to the last line.